Good morning, everyone. My name is Robert O'Brien. I'm a program director at Maine Development Foundation. I work on the Forest Economy Project. Today we have 4 panelists speaking to capital stacking for industrial redevelopment projects. I will be facilitating the meeting and technical aspect. I just want to alert everyone that this meeting is being recorded. It'll be made available later after today's presentation. If we do have time for any questions and answers, I encourage you to either enter them, type them into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If we are able to, you may raise your hand. I might be able to allow for a live questioning if we have time, but I will verbally relay your questions into the presentation if you want to type them into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And now I will turn it over to Charlie Spies, who's the chair of the 4 Maine Communities Committee.
Thanks, Robert. And thank you all for joining this morning. This is the 3rd in our series of 3 presentations with various groups to kind of tie together stories of development in or efforts around and successes and some challenges around communities that have faced loss of mill or forest-based communities that are still functioning with mills and other things. And we did it in a chronological order where we told stories, and then last time we talked about various sources of public finance and some others. And today what we're trying to do is tie that together in what we're calling a capital stack. You might also hear the term structured finance at times, and go from a conceptual picture, which I'm going to give you, to a banker's perception, and also Dan Pittman from Eaton Peabody, who works out in the legal field. So Jay will follow me, Jay Muth from Bangor Savings Bank, with Dan Pittman. And then we have Bill Ginn, who we're delighted to have joined us today to actually talk about a real deal that many of you are very much aware of in Maine, the Go Lab project in Madison. So conceptual to on-the-ground realities is what we're going at today to build on the other 2. So I just want to open by thanking again the folks that have been involved in this process for several years now through the Forest Opportunity Roadmap, all the folks who are involved in that effort directly. It's been significant funding through the Economic Development Administration, but there's also been input and work from the Department of Commerce, Department of Energy, Environmental Protection Agency, all the offices, frankly, in the state of Maine, and the administrations have been great. And I also want to thank our federal delegation, which really has been, not behind the scenes, but at the forefront of moving this all forward and helping us kind of develop strategies. And you'll hear more about these strategies as we go forward with this process. Forest Opportunity Roadmap, or 4 Maine, is an ongoing process and is really kind of picking up steam as we go. So as I mentioned, we're going to build on what we talked about earlier. And Robert, if you could put up my slide. Thank you. This is okay, great. I'm not seeing the whole slide on my screen. Hopefully folks will. Maybe it needs to go to, yeah, there we go. Okay, so on the left, you'll see one of the things that you think about in a capital stack is what is the risk to the funder? And that could be a bank, it could be an equity investor, it could be somewhere in between. And you'll note that the highest risk in these concepts models is at the bottom, and then you work your way up. So lenders, banks, and tax advantage bond issuers, by design, are seeking lower risk, a very well-formed deal with obvious ability for cash flow and collateral. And that's because they're very highly regulated, and they're designed to take that kind of risk. For example, banks have depositors, just like you and I, and they have to protect those funds that they're lending out. And that's the way they're designed to work on both sides, both for the depositor and for commercial lending. But then you have alternative lenders that move down under subordinated debt, and they have different funding sources. They're not as regulated usually, and they can take higher risk, which is what they're designed to do, and they're very good at it. And you can see the various types that you might have there: community development finance institutions, cap agencies, economic development corps. And they can often fill in below a lender to help reduce risk by taking more of that. often below them or next to them are where we start to see those public municipal financing tools like TIFs or ETIFs or new markets tax credits that are very targeted and designed to fold into that capital stack and either next to others or underneath them to again help mitigate risk and drive dollars where they're needed in a very targeted fashion. Grants is a very broad topic, but grants are in essence the basic value of a grant, if you will, is to eliminate risk on all sides. It's money that doesn't necessarily have to be repaid. Sometimes it has contingencies that say if you don't do certain things, you will have to repay this. But most often, as long as those are met, the borrower or the project doesn't have to repay. So as you can see, that eliminates risk on both sides because there's no debt repayment. And it also can then again come in as an additional cushion below the other funders. And that often can make a project go forward when otherwise it wouldn't. And then when we get to the bottom of the capital stack, that's usually where you see true equity. That's where the principals in the project are investing, or they may have outside investors. Common stock is a term that you often hear. There's also a level called preferred stock and some other forms. And depending on the size of the project and what type it is, you may just have family and friends investing, or you might have a much larger investor block. But they're at the most risk. They also have the opportunity for significant gains when things are successful. And as I note there, that shows to the others in the capital stack that there's so-called skin in the game, that there's a real commitment to this, and people believe in it, or they wouldn't be investing their money at such a high level of risk. So that's the concept around the capital stack. It's not very, very difficult to understand, really. But what people, I think, often miss, especially as they're entering project finance for the first time, is the importance of combining these things. And there are people out there, like the folks on the panel today and others, who can help walk you through that when needed. But just to understand that those are the pieces that need to come together, as you'll see as we talk with the other panelists. So I think I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Jay for the next presentation.
Great, thanks, Charlie. Robert, if you wouldn't mind putting up my presentation. So project finance capital stack, as Charlie did a great job of laying out with the diagram, there is a continuum of risk involved in any project. Robert, if you would flip to my next slide, it's the same concept of a capital stack, just a little different visual. Obviously, the bank's role in the capital stack is on the less risky side of the stack, and typically we have the highest priority of liquidation. Banks or lenders, we're not equity or venture capitalists, and as Charlie did a great job of saying, we are banks are regulated financial institutions and have a duty to protect our funding source, which is our depositors. And banks do a great job of that. It doesn't mean that we have no risk in the financing that we do, but we take a very measured approach to the investments or the loans that we do get involved in because of our regulatory framework that we have to operate under, and our internal policies, which each bank has different policies, but it's designed to provide an operating model for the bank. The external would be the regulatory requirements that we have to meet in order to get an acceptable rating from our financial regulator, because without that, the bank wouldn't be around. And having a proper mix of equity, whether it's grants, what I'm calling hybrid financing, or subordinated debt in a project finance. It's going to be that mix that will if it's in the appropriate fashion, you'll be able to, I'd say, entice a bank to come in that senior debt position if all the, I'll call it the stars align. From a banking standpoint, we take a look at each deal. Every deal is unique. I've been doing this for 33 years, and I don't know that I've seen any commercial financing that is the same as the last one I did. But we do take a standard approach to evaluating whether we make an investment or make a loan. And that's, you've probably heard before, the 4 C's of credit. And if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, Robert, obviously everyone thinks the bank has all kinds of money sitting around and we're just looking to put it to work, and we do. We are looking to put depositors' dollars to work as an investments to help our communities, help our small businesses prosper, but we have to do that in a responsible way. So if you could go to the next slide, please. And as I said, we look at things using the 4 C's of credit, and those are character, capital, capacity, and collateral. And what I'd like to do is just kind of go in a little more depth with each one of these 4 C's, just so you understand how we look at things. So if we could go to the next slide. Character. That's the people or the sponsors behind a project. What's their background? What's their experience and track record to make the enterprise that they're looking to do successful? I've been a banker for 33 years. If I went to a bank and said I'd like to open up a restaurant, I would hope that the lender would have pause, because I have no experience in the restaurant business other than I like to eat. So we spend a fair amount of time, I'd say, asking questions about the sponsors to get a handle on their background and their experience level, to make sure that they have the requisite management experience and expertise for whatever the project is that they're looking to get us involved in. Next slide, please. Capital, this whole presentation is about the capital stack. What we're looking for is the sufficiency of capital in relationship to the project size and scope. Is there an appropriate amount of equity? If it's a complex project like a mill redevelopment, are there other sources of funding, such as grants or subsidies or subordinated debt? And are they in, when it's all said and done, is there enough equity or enough funding in the capital stack below where the bank's going to be, to give the bank a cushion and allow us to have a collateral position and a cash flow position where we have a demonstrated means to get repaid. And first and foremost, from a repayment source, we look at the capacity, and then a secondary, we're typically looking to have some sort of a collateral position. So if we could go to the next slide. Capacity, again, where's the cash flow from this project? Is it sufficient to service the debt and provide the investors with a return on their investment? So this is where we're basically asking the sponsors of a project to show us the money. How is it going to be generated? In a lot of projects, we're relying on financial projections. And so we're going to look for quality and realistic financial projections with all relevant assumptions identified. And we're going to analyze that to see if we agree with the sponsors that, if we invest in this project, that there's a high likelihood that these financial projections will come forth. Next slide, please. And collateral. So as a regulated financial institution, we're looking for a primary source of repayment. That's the cash flow. And then typically we're looking for some sort of a secondary repayment source, which would be a secured position in collateral, whether it's real estate, equipment, working assets like accounts receivable, inventory, those sorts of things. So then it comes, okay, how do we value that? And in a project, there's a difference between the cost of bringing that project online typically and the appraised value of that project. And because we are regulated and we have internal policies, as most folks on this call know, there can be a huge difference between the cost of bringing a project online and the appraised value. And typically, we lend based on the lower of cost or appraisal. So because of those differences between cost and appraisal, there can be a huge gap. And the bank is willing, able, and we do it all the time to work with other agencies to mitigate that risk. If that's the only huge challenge that we see in a project, we can mitigate that collateral position by using credit enhancements such as USDA Rural Development, the Finance Authority of Maine, and others like that to reduce the risk that the bank has for our secondary repayment source. Again, each project is unique, and we take a look at those 4 C's in a systematic approach, making sure that all of those puzzle pieces fit together and make sense, that the management is capable, that there's an appropriate amount of capital in the project and for ongoing working capital needs, that there's a means of generating cash flow, whether that's from an operating company or from, I'll say, rent payments from a piece of real estate, and then ultimately that there's a fallback position with some sort of collateral. Next slide. So that's kind of my high-level view of project finance and the approach that the bank would take in looking at one. I appreciate the opportunity to present today, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to, as Robert said, put the question in the chat or raise your hand. Thank you.
Hey, Robert, if I could just interject quickly, I hope what people see there is, as Jay described, what he needs to move forward. You can see how the lower layers of the capital stack fill in underneath, and that's really how Jay can move forward. So just that connection there, and he mentioned a few things like FAME and USDA on credit enhancement, and then you move down to how do you fill in the other pieces of capital. So just wanted to comment on that. Thank you.
And I would just add also, when there's multiple players in the capital stack, the bank is able and willing to integrate with those other players in the funding stack, because each one of those players may have different structures or needs that they have in order to get involved, and being able to integrate all of those layers to make sure that everyone can meet their needs and get involved. That's where there's needs to be cooperation between all of the different players. And the bank, again, we're going to look out for what we feel is most important, and other players in that stack will do it. But we're more than willing to integrate with that capital stack.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. That's a really good point. These aren't silos. There's a lot of communication that goes on, and Dan may comment on that in a second.
I just want to interject that Jim Robbins, who also works at Bangor Savings Bank and is a member of the 4 Maine Communities Committee, added in the chat that in addition to risk mitigation and the provision of debt, one of the hallmarks of the capital stacks is that it almost always involves public-private partnership. From a community development perspective, public-private partnerships lead to more comprehensive and sustainable community development, engaging often diverse stakeholders and participants. The impact is often felt well beyond the subject project.
You know, that's an excellent comment. And, you know, we're involved with a mill redevelopment project in northern Maine that is a public-private capital stack. And that project, as it moves forward, will have broad and far-reaching impact on the Katahdin region. And, you know, we're happy to be a part of that. But if it wasn't for the leaders behind that effort being so dedicated and persistent, and the public-private partnership, you know, it would just be a mill site that's sitting there doing nothing. But there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and when that project is completed, it will have, again, far-reaching economic impact on that region, much like any of the other mill redevelopment projects that are planned or underway.
Excellent.
Okay. I guess that's a good transition to me. Thanks, Jay, for the banker's perspective on this. Robert, am I on?
Yes, Dan,
Okay.
you are live. And before
Sorry
we jump
about
into it, I just want to, we have another chat comment that I think is relevant. Tim Curtis, who's the town manager in Madison, made the point that for the most part, substantial grant funding cannot go to the private business, but must go through the municipality.
Yeah.
With
Yeah,
that, Dan, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks very much. That's an excellent point, and I'll touch on that briefly. Before I begin, I guess we've obviously heard the bank's perspective, and it's really obvious why it's important to hear the bank's perspective. I'm a lawyer in Eaton Peabody's Economic Development and Government Relations group, and it might be a little bit less clear what I bring to the table today, but I think it's worth thinking about the lawyer's role because it does tie into what a capital stack is. We've talked about building the capital stack. You've sort of seen, you know, org charts that make them look like an edifice, and I think that's not a bad analogy. And I would say if we think of putting together a capital stack as a building project, then, you know, the economic development directors, the municipal officials, the developers who are trying to bring the project together are really the architects. You're the ones who have the vision. You're the ones who find the resources and start pulling ideas together, pulling projects together, start talking to the people who are going to be your most important funding sources. So it's really that high level work really happens before the lawyers get involved. Typically, the lawyer I think of as more of the engineer on the project. Our job is to look over the plans that you've come up with and make sure that all these walls on your financing pyramid are going to be load bearing, and there's not going to be one element that doesn't play well with another. Or if we get a grant from this source over here, then that means we can't take funds from this source over here. So a lot of what lawyers do is facilitate the communication that Charlie was talking about. A lot of what lawyers do is look for problems down the road and coordinate ways to find that that these capital stacks are harmonious and work with each other well, because it's a complicated way to build financing, and therefore there are a lot of ways it can go wrong. So our job is to sort of make sure the plans are up to code, and then oversee construction to make sure that the construction goes according to plan. And I think it's worth stepping back for a second and remembering what I think of as the most important rule in putting together a capital stack. The best articulation I've heard of it came from Heather Johnson, the DACD commissioner. She said that the most important thing is to remember that you got to find the project first, right? You build the capital stack around the project. You don't build the project around the capital stack. There are a couple of reasons for that. Maybe it's obvious, but the most important one is if the economics of the deal don't pencil out, if there's just no way when we get to the end of the day that this project that you're working on is going to be able to be self-sustaining, then it's a waste. And we've seen examples in Maine and elsewhere where thinking about available capital has gotten ahead of project resources. There's a story unfolding in Wisconsin about a Foxconn plant that's they spent years. It's been in the news lately. If you might have seen it, but they spent years building a capital stack and never really thought about the business plan, and that's starting to have pretty significant repercussions. So for this sort of project to work, you really have to start with a project that makes sense economically and figure out how to get from here to there, as opposed to saying, here are all our resources, how can we find something that will fit with them? And as I say, once you've got a project that works, the most important thing from my perspective is making sure that all the elements play well together. There are some elements of capital stacks that you traditionally see that tend to work very well together, and others where they either don't fit with each other or don't necessarily fit with the project. I'll talk about a few of those, but as an example of something that generally does play well, we've talked in prior panels about the funding from the Maine Rural Development Association, which plays a very important role in a lot of community development projects around here, and they can provide substantial amounts of financial support for projects that have significant economic development components, but they almost always require some component of local match, usually a municipal match of some sort. And that can be tough to arrange. That requires, often that requires going into a mill community that's been devastated and saying, hey, we've got this dream for how we're going to revitalize this mill that you've all, that you've seen fail and the community be gutted around and everyone's dispirited about. We've got this great idea, but we need to come up with some local funds, and that can be difficult to do. The Economic Development Authority is often able to give funds that can be used towards that local match. So MRDA and EDA play very well together, and you'll see any number of deals where there are MRDA and EDA funds that come in together, and that's why they're sort of like peas and carrots. They just naturally go well together. That's not true with all elements of the capital stack. And I want to be mindful of the time. I know I'm certainly looking forward to Bill's presentation. I'm sure we all are. So I just want to speak briefly about some sort of concerns we can have that show us that maybe these stacks won't work together. A lot of them have to do with timing. The timing on these is very, very tricky often. A lot of times what you'll find is that as the project starts to come together, you'll find private parties who are willing to put up some money, put up some capital, and that's sort of what's often the impetus for saying, well, there's a project here, there's a viable project here, but we don't have enough capital, so we need to go start looking out. So often you'll sort of have an idea of where a lot of the private financing is going to come from. A lot of funds that are out there are federal, one way or another, either funds or tax credits, that sort of stuff. And it's almost always important to get started with the federal components as quickly as possible. Those tend, not surprisingly maybe, to take a long time to get approvals, and they tend to be, sometimes they can be moving targets. For instance, there are a lot of tax incentive tax credits for energy efficiency projects. The law on that, because of the way Congress writes budgets and because of the way budgeting rules work, those tend to phase out over relatively narrow time frames. So you have to be very careful about what the timing of the federal credit availability is, and you have to sort of think about how that's going to play with your construction schedule a lot of times. Other times, sometimes we found you need approvals for particularly biomass facilities from the federal government that can be very slow. So you really have to think about the timing, particularly with federal money. And on the other hand, a lot of times the state of Maine also participates in these programs through grants or other methods. Often you'll find that state money tends to come in last. That's in part because it tends to be a relatively smaller component, so it's more about filling in the gaps of your capital stack than sort of here is the main component of your capital stack. But also I think that the state agencies have a tendency to sort of want to piggyback on the due diligence that's being done by other participants in the project. They want to see that we've got private investors lined up, we've got the federal government approvals that we need, and then that makes it a little bit easier for the state agencies to say, yeah, we can support this project. It's been pretty thoroughly vetted. So you really do have to think about timing. You have to start thinking about it fairly early, because a lot of the timing components can be among the most difficult. And I see I'm running out of time here, so I want to move quickly. But there are also a lot of funding opportunities that are appropriate for some projects and not for others. For instance, a lot of really important deals in Maine have been done using historic tax credits or other sort of federal tax credit programs. And for projects that qualify, those are extremely powerful tools. The problem is, I've been talking about architecture of capital stacks. I sort of think of a pyramid. We see these, a broad base and a narrower point. If you want to start talking about tax credit deals, you're really talking more about some sort of, a palace built by Mad King Ludwig. You get these org charts that look completely baffling. That's an indication that there's a great deal of complication. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that means that the complication itself and the sensitivity of some of the tax credit issues means that it's going to be very expensive just to build that superstructure. And there are projects that are not large enough to support that superstructure. There are projects where the weight of the procedural requirements on the capital stack just are too big for the project. The juice ain't worth the squeeze, as they say. So typically you're going to see tax credit deals are going to be fairly large deals. I don't know, maybe certainly in the order of several million and up. Not as useful for some of the smaller projects that we see. On the other hand, when you have a big project and you need to find that sort of funding, it's often very helpful. We've talked about FAME loans over the course of these presentations a number of times. FAME loans are another terrific opportunity, another one where you have to think carefully about the timing, because a loan from FAME, or at least the kinds of loans that I work with FAME on, are essentially commercial deals that are dressed up in this robe of tax exemption. That gets you a preferential interest rate. It drops your interest costs a bit. And that can be very important when you're having trouble, getting from point A to point B in your financing. But dressing up a loan deal in tax exempt clothing takes some time. There's an extensive application that needs to be sent into FAME. FAME needs some time to review it. There needs to be a public hearing. Then the FAME board needs to meet. And really only then can you start moving on the project, and then you have to get the governor's approval, which depending on the governor, can either go swiftly or slowly. So FAME loans, you need to be very careful about timing, and the nice thing about FAME loans is they tend to support some projects that are in that sweet spot of not necessarily being large enough to apply for some of the larger programs. There are two basic kinds of FAME bonds that I work with all the time. Some for tax exempt organizations. We've talked about those. Those are sometimes, but not all that often, great tools in the economic development context. The problem is, if you're issuing a 501c3 bond, the facility that's being financed has to be owned and occupied by a 501c3 organization. So typically, if you're looking at a mill development deal, for instance, then you're looking at commercial tenants, and that's going to be tough to make play with a 501c3 bond through FAME. FAME also has a program for what are called qualified small manufacturing bonds. These are bonds to support manufacturing facilities. These can work very well with redevelopment projects, but again, there are limits on the size of the project. The maximum amount you can borrow is 10 million, and the borrower has to be, the ultimate user of the facility has to be a qualified manufacturer, a small manufacturer, which is defined in the IRS regulations. It's a very complicated analysis, but basically the idea is your capital expenditures over the course of 6 years have to be under $20 million. So it doesn't work for a local affiliate of a large international, a multinational corporation or something like that. But for a lot of Maine businesses and Maine manufacturers, those are terrific opportunities that work well. I am almost out of time. I just want to mention very briefly one more thing. We have talked in other presentations briefly about opportunity zones. I have not had a lot of success with opportunity zones in Maine. The idea of an opportunity zone is this is a relatively new tax provision in the federal code that allows individual businesses that have a substantial capital gain that they're ready to recognize to defer that gain if they invest in what's called an opportunity zone. So imagine that you're selling your business. You know, you've been a dentist for 40 years, you're retiring now, you're selling your practice, and you have a huge capital gain. Instead of paying tax on that in year one, you can reinvest that into an opportunity zone, and you get all sorts of great tax benefits for it. The problem with that has been in Maine that the money in opportunity zones is really, and the tax benefits really go to properties where you expect rapid appreciation, particularly in the value of the land. And that's just, you know, that's historically not been the case in Maine the way it has been in some places. So for instance, opportunity zones in New York and New Jersey have been doing absolutely gangbusters, but it's been a lot harder to find projects in Maine where the economics pencil out. So obviously that's a very rushed presentation and doesn't get too far into the weeds, but I just want to emphasize again that it's one thing to talk about the sources of capital. It's another thing to understand that it really is important to start thinking early and to continually think about how these sources are going to work together, how they're going to work with your project, and to keep checking in on that, because the more complications you have in your structure, the more potential there is for conflict, and you need to head that off at the pass if at all possible. With that, I'll turn it over to Bill, but thank you all very much. And if you have any questions, feel free to give me a shout.
Great, thank you, Dan. That was excellent. Bill, I will share your presentation, and you are on when you're ready. Just a moment. There it is. There you go. So Bill, there you go. Very good.
There you go. I didn't seem to have control of the muting. Hey, good morning, everybody. Glad to be with you. What are we trying to do in Madison? Let's start there. We're planning to build a state-of-the-art facility to make insulation using German technology from wood fiber. This is a high performance material. It's proven in Europe. There's over 700 million in sales annually, and it's growing quite rapidly because of its climate friendly, sustainable nature. But it's never been made in the United States. So you have a proven product in other parts of the world, which we believe is ideally suited for Maine's abundant wood supply, our northern climate, and the billions and billions of dollars worth of insulation needs that we have in North America. And that's growing, of course, every year as we experience increases in building codes and recognize the importance of highly efficient buildings. So that's what we're trying to do, is to make a suite of insulation products that will service this industry. Next slide. Can you get me the next slide? Maybe. There you go. So we're starting this business at the Madison, oops, one too far. We're starting this business at the Madison Mill in Madison, Maine. It's what we hope will be a first of a number of plants across the United States. The nature of the insulation business is that you're making a very lightweight product. It doesn't ship very far. And so you need lots of regional plants in order to build out your business. So Madison represents a great place for us to be starting as a company. But the plan is to build a $1 billion business across the United States with Maine as its headquarters. I want to be humble about what we've accomplished here because it's not done yet. We have purchased the mill. We're deep into engineering and the financing phase of this project. But we still have a lot of work to do in order to complete our capital stack. There was a critical fork in the road, which I might just mention here, which is this mill is privately owned. That's different than a number of the other mill development projects. That creates some problems for us in that we are unable to receive, in most cases, federal grants directly from, say, EDA or other mechanisms which are designed for say, community development organizations and not for for-profit businesses. On the other hand, it is also true that when you're borrowing capital commercially, owning the real estate is a critical piece of collateral. And often in our case, when we're looking at borrowing tens of millions of dollars for this project, if the real estate was severed from the production equipment, that would create problems for the actual financing of the project, because people are leery about financing equipment when they don't know whether there's going to be a place for that equipment to be actually used and managed. So it's a two-edged sword here, I guess, to have a private ownership. It has really important features from a financing perspective, but it also makes it more complicated to work with grants. I would say that we are very blessed by a very creative and thoughtful town as a host to this project. And I saw Tim Curtis in his comments earlier on, a great example, I think, of the kind of working relationship that a private industry needs to have in a host community to be able to work through some of the issues about, well, could the town receive the grant and then on-lend the capital or make a separate investment in a part of the project that that suits the requirements of those grants. So we've been very creative, and the town of Madison has been really supportive of all of those efforts. Next slide. So we're trying to build what in the first phase will be a $58 million project. So it's a big project by lots of standards, although I would say when we're talking about mill redevelopment projects, it's hard to find a substantial project that isn't, 30, 40, 50, $100 million in its scope. And that is also one of the challenges of Maine, because most of the tools that we have in Maine are designed for small business and not really designed for big industrial developments like the project that we're involved in. And I think many of the other large mill projects that are on the drawing boards, whether it's a CLT plant or a biofuel plant, or even some of the major construction and modular development kinds of facilities. I would also say that there's no silver bullet here. That is to say, if you think you're going to get one and done, I just need to get that one financing piece done and we're good. That's just not the way it works. We have more than a dozen elements to our financing plan. Each one has its own challenges and issues. And so it's a complicated and a complex funding structure. I don't think that that's unique, however, to GoLab. I think it comes with the territory of doing big, complicated projects, unless you happen to be a big corporation and have lots of equity and could just finance it off of your balance sheet, which is pretty rare in the state of Maine. So here are the elements of the financing plan that we're putting in place for Madison. And I'll just tick down them because I think it'll give you some flavor for how we're operating here. Angel investment, some might call this seed investment. We've now actually crossed the $6 million threshold there. These are typically $50,000 to $1 million investments. In our case, they're expressed as a convertible note. That is, it's a note until a borrowing, until such time as the primary financing for the facility closes. And at that point, those notes convert into shares in the company. And those shares are also shares which have bonus features, because one of the problems that all companies face is, what is the value of the investment? Well, this is a sort of a way to kick the can and say that the value of the angel investments will be determined by the first major investor in the business at some point in the future. So you inherit that valuation. The other thing about angel investments, and this is really important, is that in Maine's case, you qualify for the seed tax credit, which is a very powerful 40% tax credit against investments in qualified projects such as ours. So it is something that you should definitely be thinking about in terms of subsidies. Grants, you know, we have a lot of different grants here in this project. Maine Development Foundation, through our partnership with Madison, for example, has provided funding for our project. We have community development block grants, but we also have grants from the U.S. Forest Service for certifying our products under UL listings and the like. So this is a rich and important area. If you're a for-profit, it requires a lot of extra work. Series A equity, you know, this is the real money. We're deep into that right now. We've raised about half of that. We have the other half to go. Series A just simply refers to, you know, the first major equity investment in the business. These are investors who are typically investing $1 to $5 million in our project for a substantial ownership position in the company. And it's these Series A investments which will trigger and value the angel investment that I spoke of earlier. Loans, we have three types of loans in this project. The first is what I would call development loans. These are relatively small loans from CEI, from FAME, from Eastern Maine Development Corporation, from the town of Madison, Somerset County Economic Development, all of the groups that are out there that are working to foster economic development often have products and capabilities to lend into new and startup businesses. And that $2.4 million of this loan stack has been critical for us in being able to move our project forward. There's also $2 million worth of mezzanine debt here. This is debt that it's called mezzanine because it sits below, or if you will, between the senior lenders who have priority and the equity holders who have no priority really from an economic collateral perspective. And that mezzanine debt in our case has a convertible feature which allows them to not only get their loan repaid, but also to get some shares of the company as a bonus for the extra risk they're taking. The majority of this capital stack will be a senior lender, and we have proposals from two different banks, one out of state and one in state, to be our senior lender here. That senior lender position would never be tenable for a startup like this were it not for the potential of FAME guarantees. So FAME's role here is critical. There again, though, the fact that Maine has so few tools for big businesses is a real challenge. FAME is limited in startup businesses to guaranteeing or providing about $5.5 million worth of total support to a project. For established businesses, around $7.5 million of support. That's not a lot of money when you're talking about, you know, $50, $60 million projects. So our lack of ability to provide guarantees is a real problem, I think, for larger enterprises. The last two blocks there on this have to do with the new market tax credit transaction. And we could spend days going through what a new market tax credit transaction is, but the simple point, I guess, here, and it's not simple, but the simple point here is that the federal government has programs for qualified census districts, and our project fits into that project, which says that certain types of equity, which are invested in the qualified project can get a federal tax credit, in this case over 7 years and worth about 39% of the total investment. You are allowed to basically sell the value of that tax credit at day one of the project financing. And when you sell that tax credit to, say, a financial institution, you get cash at closing. And so you might have a $50 million tax credit, but its economic value to you, in our case, roughly $12 million worth of ultimate value in the form of cash. So it's an example of using these creative federal programs that are designed to finance complicated industrial projects in rural development. So those are the main points of our capital stack. As I said before, there's no silver bullet here. You have to work through all of these elements. They each have their own individual characteristics and capabilities. We're optimistic that we're going to be closing this whole financial package sometime in March or April of this coming year. Our effort right now is to bring to fruition the final elements that are necessary for our senior loan, for the completion of the last of the equity round, the securing of the final new market tax credits, and the like. So let me stop there, and hopefully that gives you some appreciation of what we've been trying to do. Oh, I have one other thing I wanted to say, which is if you are interested in this stuff, I've actually published a book that's out on Island Press that came out in May of this year called Valuing Nature, and it's a handbook for impact investors. All the proceeds are donated to the Nature Conservancy, so I get no economic value. So it's not shameless commerce here. But those of you who have an interest in delving more into these questions of capital stacks and how to think about sophisticated financing projects, it's my best thinking anyway. Whether it's worthwhile, it'll be up to you as to what we need to do in order to get more of this kind of financing into the natural resource-based industry. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Bill. That was fantastic. And Jay and Dan, I think you all just kind of the order of the speakers and capping it off with what's happening on a real world project in Madison is just fantastic. Also, I'll note that Bill had a prior book called Investing in Nature, and I've read that one cover to cover. That came out probably 15 years ago. And so I'm delighted to hear you have a new one out there, and I can tell the crowd that Bill's experience is incredibly valuable, and I would recommend looking into his publications as sources. So that's an additional one we didn't know we were going to get today. I'm very happy about that. So thank you all for your input. I see a question here. What do Dan and Bill and Jay think about the opportunities for financing? Valuing Nature is on my list now. So I guess the question is, what are the general opportunities? Maybe that's how hard it is. I'm not quite sure. Bill, you commented on the scale of state-based programs and things along those lines. And
well, let me just say that I think we have some real work to do in the state of Maine to build a more robust economic development suite of tools for these kinds of big projects. I hate to say it, but we've suffered from smallitis here in the state. We have a lot of tools that are great for little tiny software businesses, that need a few $1 million, but we don't have a lot of robust tools. I mentioned the FAME limits. For us, the FAME limit is $5.5 million. On what will ultimately, through all phases, be a $70 million project, that's practically irrelevant, except for the fact that it's a key to getting a bank to provide a little bit of financing for us. But banks would do a lot more for us if there was a much more robust guarantee environment associated with that. Groups like the Maine Venture Capital, for example, again, they have very small limits on the size of the projects that they can put into these activities. Sadly, the legislature in the last round, I think ill-advised, frankly, lowered the limits on the Maine seed tax credit from $5 million to $3.5 million eligible for individual projects. That's a terrible outcome for big, complicated projects like ours, who need, more support, not less support from those kinds of vehicles. So, we have a lot of work in order to move forward. I do know that the Commission on Restarting the Maine Economy, I think that's its name, is putting forth a whole platform of bond issues and new capacities. And I urge all of us to be working hard with our legislature in all of our communities to, ask them to take a serious look at those kinds of new capacities, because we're going to need that in Maine if we're going to do big things. You just can't take the Madison mill, for example, was appraised at, before it went bankrupt, I think it was on the tax rolls at $170 million. I can't even imagine what Great Northern was on the books for, what Lincoln was on the books for. Think of Maine, losing their digesters, now laying off people today. That's a $200 million project to replace those digesters. We just don't have tools like that that are capable and robust in the state of Maine to make those kinds of investments that we need to grow our natural resource-based industries. These are capital hogs. They need a lot of capital in order to be successful. And we just need better tools here for us to be successful. It's nobody's fault. It's just the reality of where we find ourselves today. So there's work to be done by all of us who care about this, whether you're a municipality or a for-profit business.
Thanks, Bill. And my observation over the 30 years I've been involved in this is some natural resource-based companies, especially fishing and others, are very proud of being fiercely independent. But when you scale up to what you're talking about, you can't go it alone as a state. You mentioned some major external sources of funding, and we really need to be thinking about how we attract those in for the scale that types of projects that you're working on. And it's as much a perspective as it is the tools themselves. And so conversations with legislators and the administration and others about that kind of thing are important. We're about out of time. There may be questions that are coming in. We are going to produce this again, is recorded, but also I think I can speak for the panelists in that if you have follow-up questions, we will make sure that we get those out to the panelists. There's a lot that we covered here. I think there was a very realistic approach to these are the pieces that you need. I liked Dan's analysis around architectures and engineers, and Bill might be both the composer and the conductor of a large orchestra, the way he's pulling those pieces together. And that's the reality of the situation, and who you put on your team and the capacity that Jay was looking at. They take comfort from having people like Bill and Dan on the team that know how to pull these things together. So a lot to it, certainly not impossible. And it might be overwhelming when you just look at it all together. But like so many things, you've got to take one piece at a time and see how they combine and work with some good people to get it done. Robert, did you have anything else, or do any of the panelists have any final comments they'd like to make? Okay. Well, thank you all. This concludes our three-part series. We also would welcome comments from our participants about what might be the next best thing we could talk to you about relative to your community's redevelopment and adjustments in today's world. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to the panelists, and as I mentioned at the beginning, all the folks who have been involved in Forest Opportunity Roadmap. I think we're good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.